Welcome to Conversations with a Wounded Healer. I'm your host, Sarah Bueno. I'm a psychotherapist, teacher, consultant, and most importantly, a wounded healer, living and working in Skokie, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. This is a space for thought-provoking, unscripted conversations with people from all walks of life, united by the shared mission of healing ourselves while promoting healing in the world around us. Whether you're here to find inspiration, learn, or simply feel seen, you're invited on this journey of healing from the individual to the collective. Thanks for joining me. Hello, my friends. How are you doing on this fine day, or evening, or morning, wherever it is that you are? So, if you did not listen to part 1 of my interview with Ted Rau, I'm going to ask you to stop this podcast, go back to the last episode, and listen to that before you get into this. I will also just say for folks who did listen to that, or I don't know, maybe you're like, no, I don't want to listen to Ted part 1. I just want to listen to Ted part 2. We are doing a different schedule with Conversations with a Wounded Healer. We're going to be splitting our interviews into 2 half-hour-ish episodes. And so you're going to get the interview delivered in a part 1 and part 2. And we're in a part 2 today. And we're now trying out a semester type schedule with the podcast. So we are in our spring semester right now. We're going to take a little bitty short break, 3 weeks off in the summer. And then we'll take off the Thanksgiving week and the last 2 weeks in December. So we're just trying this out for 2025 to see how it feels, both for me and for y'all. And I'm going to hear your feedback to know whether it is working for you. The other thing I'm super excited about is next week, we're going to air our episode that culminates in our 7-year anniversary for Conversations with a Wounded Healer. I've been doing this podcast for 7 years. Lucky number 7. And for lucky number 7, we're going to have a major giveaway. So get excited for that. Put it on your calendar. I'll tell you all the details next time we release an episode. But let's get back to my conversation with Ted Rau. So you heard us introduce Sociocracy, sort of talk about it from the business perspective, and also get into a little bit of the healing aspect of it. And it makes me think about how we are together. Anne and I, in our last episode, her last episode, talked a little bit about she and I being able to sit and be together over really challenging conversations, things that we really vehemently disagreed on. You know, it was challenging, I think, for Anne to understand my perspective in certain instances, and yet we stayed connected in relationship. This is one thing that I think we're being called to as a collective right now. I'm seeing, and I've talked about this so much, I wonder, I really do want to hear from you. Are you seeing the same thing that I'm seeing? Because on the therapist Facebook groups, I'm just really concerned about the ways that we're treating each other, the ways that we are blaming one another and shaming one another and judging one another. And it's me included. I'm not saying that like, I'm sitting here on high, not judging anybody and I'm doing it right. No, I'm judging the fuck out of people. Let's be honest. And that judgment is one of the things that I keep coming back to in therapy over and over and over again. But here's what I want. Like, this is the vision that I see for us. I see therapists having the tools that most people without our specific education don't normally have. I mean, I certainly didn't have them before I became a therapist and started trying to like walk in integrity in a really specific way. I think that we have special tools that we can be using to help our cultures heal. The political divide is bazonkers. Yes, that's a combination of the word bonkers and bizarre. It's just, it feels like everywhere you turn, there's somebody, you know, telling you didn't say something right, or you're trying to oppress me, or all this and that. And while that can be true, that's not the end of the story. If we stop with, you're saying it wrong or you're doing it wrong, we're not offering a creative vision for the future. I just attended a webinar with this organization called Harmonize, and I'm trying to have them on as guests because I want them to talk about their amazing work. And one of the things they talked about was moving from critique to creation. And I think we're really stuck in critique right now. And we have to begin to think of what would it be like for us to begin to adopt a more safe to try attitude in our work, in our communities, in our relationships, in our social justice. What would that look like? What would that feel like? And I think Sociocracy might have some tools to help us get there. So I'm going to introduce Ted again because you can never read somebody's bio too much. Ted Rau is an advocate, trainer, and consultant for self-governance with a focus on sociocracy. After earning a PhD in linguistics and working in academia, he co-founded Sociocracy For All in 2016. Ted consults with mission-driven organizations, teaches, and actively participates in Sociocracy For All's work. A transgender man and father of 5, Ted has lived in Massachusetts since 2010. Please enjoy part 2 of my conversation with Ted Rau.
There's so much interplay also between kind of that, how do you hold your personal power? I mean, that's why the right use of power stuff is also so relevant, but also just the basic skills in therapy, right? Mm-hmm. So basically, sociocracy requires for individuals to have that sorted out to some extent.
Yes.
But the other piece is that in a really interesting way, sociocracy becomes a practice ground to try on and try out and practice, like practice as in achieve some stamina in holding yourself in this way in relationship to others.
Yes.
And there are some tools that really help people. For example, one simple practice that I haven't talked about yet, that we do rounds in sociocracy. So let's say I have an idea and I bring it to my circle. And the facilitator, we always have a facilitator, like one of us will hold the facilitator role at the same time. And the facilitator will then typically do a round and say, like, what do you think about Ted's idea? And then we hear one by one by one by one, and nobody speaks a second time until everybody has spoken. The good thing about that is that we avoid this back and forth of like, well, what you said is not going to work. Well, totally it's going to work. This back and forth, but it slows it down just enough that people can kind of take a breath because it's not their turn right now. Yeah. And I used to be one of the people that would interject and, have another idea and say, oh, no, yeah, this and that. Yeah, it's so much. Yeah. And I've really fallen out of that habit. It's kind of, I've been conditioned the other way now. Now I'm much more listening. And I just don't assume that I know instantly. And somehow our brains are funny in that way, right? And that we get tricked into thinking, a part of our brain tricks us into thinking that we have something here.
Yes.
And if we just slow it down enough, and that's what rounds do anyway. So people get to experience that in meetings. And then often that actually has a very healing and kind of making you more rounded the effect is quite interesting. Also, I think people miss having that space of being responsible and being held accountable in this healthy way that is not mean or overpowering, but just calling people to the carpet. I'm like, we need, we have to figure this out here.
Right.
So what's your contribution to that? I think it really helps people grow up and heal at the same time.
I love that. And I think that's exactly right. When I think about the therapy profession, I have concerns about the level of health of the profession overall, especially post-pandemic. Like I said, I don't think it's necessarily that there's all these unhealthy people doing work, but I think a lot of people got traumatized or burnt out during the pandemic and haven't been able to take a breath, because it's funny, like now the referrals have stopped coming in and it's kind of going back to pre-pandemic levels. But everybody built their businesses so big, they're freaking out that they can't fill caseloads. So they can't just relax and be with it. So we're at a crisis.
Well, it's a new sort of stress.
Right.
I see.
Yeah. So it's fascinating business to watch from this larger perspective. And I'm, this is a bit of a different topic to be having on here, a conversation about healing. But what you just said is right. To invite everybody to grow up and really be part of the process, where I guess it's a delicate balance of knowing yourself and being able to know the business, know the other people in the organization. There's a lot of trust that has to be developed. There's a lot of not just trust in the organization, but trust in self, right? Trust that you can sit with discomfort, trust that you will be okay if you try something and it fails. There's so much here that is really a call to evolution that I really want the listeners to hear, because that's the piece in it that is so exciting for me. And all this is giving me goosebumps, because these are answers to what we've been looking for. But I'm afraid people are going to be so scared, they're just not going to be able to tolerate it.
Yeah, and some of that we hear, when people are like, yeah, that's all. Like, for example, I'm betting that at least a third of listeners are like, yeah, that sounds kind of nice, but it's probably too good to be true. I mean, can it really work? Like, yes, it can really work. Like, people use this. Sometimes, I tell people about this and they're like, oh, that sounds like a nice theory. I'm like, no, this is not a theory. You must be aware, like, there are organizations running like this.
Right.
Like, and there's a certain cynicism or just resignation that people feel, I think, around these things. Right. That sometimes the easiest way to go through life is to just assume that organizations just are shitty.
Right.
That's just what it is.
Right.
And of course, it's the boss's fault on top of everything. Right, but even beyond that, it's just, so how can we snap out of the cynicism? And what I've noticed, just as kind of our strategy, is, first of all, you can't convince anybody. That's clear.
Yep.
And the only thing we can do is put it out there as an option so that those who have that glimmer of hope inside of them can find it. And the other piece is just also real life experience. Like, I've had it so often that people are like, I was skeptical, but then we tried it out and it felt so good, I don't want to do anything else.
Boom.
So there's something about experiential learning or just being in it where, like, oh,
yeah.
And then, like, for example, what we have quite often is that people are like, well, is this going to make my business more efficient? Are we going to be more profitable and so on? And we're like, yeah, maybe, let's see, because it can be this way or that way. If you talk about everything 20 times, probably not. So this is not a guarantee at all. But what I've noticed again and again is people start with that question and then they do it. And then they're just like, this is just who I want to be.
Yeah.
So all the questions of profitability, of course, are still important, but all of a sudden who we want to be becomes the question. And how do I want to relate to my coworkers? And like, all of the other stuff is kind of footnotes in the, like, and I completely agree with you. There's something about growing up, both as individuals and as organizations, that this is all about for me. This is what it is for me. And it just seems to be in the air of something around that needs to shift, because we've all been kind of in this collective holding pattern, probably for, one could say for millennia, it's like, this doesn't seem to be it. Yeah. It just can't be that bad. And sometimes when I ask people, like, how did you find us? I remember there was this person who told me, I always want to know what they Googled, for strategic reasons. They typically don't know. So I asked this person, she's like, I don't even know what I Googled. I was just sitting in front of my computer and thinking, there just must be a better way. Oh. So, like, yeah, it's that longing that we're trying to speak to. Like, yes.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of that, we've dropped the H word, the healer word. And I'm curious if in this work that you're doing, would you consider yourself a healer?
It's such an interesting question. I could have seen that coming. Yeah. That seems like a big word to put on, a big label to put on. I'm afraid hold on, give me just 1 second.
Take your time. Yeah. It is a big question.
Because it seems like not kind of too big of a shoe to put on. And then on the other hand, I guess part of me wants to say, no, I just show people, how to heal themselves, which is maybe what it is all about. I kind of see myself as that second or even at this point, third line person, like I help facilitators, for example, or leaders and so on, adopt the system. And at this point, I help other people adopt the system. But I'm just so excited by people doing it themselves. So no, I'm maybe not a healer. I'm a healer supporter. I'm a self-healing supporter. How about we go with that?
I love it. Well, and my definition is I think we're all healers. So that's kind of the catch-all. I think everybody has that capacity. It's just whether you've chosen to step into it or not. And so I can call you a healer. And that seems to be what a lot of people will land on. They'll be like, I'm not putting that on my business card, but if you want to say that, okay.
You know what? There's one interesting thing that has come up for me. This is like the first time I say this out loud, so that's interesting. is that I do see myself, I think, as a healer, but more of
Yes.
organizations. And by that, I mean something more like I have so much respect for organizations and I almost see them like a new species. Like there's a species of the collective version of all of us. And I feel a lot of affection and tenderness and excitement around that. And
Mhm.
there I would say, yes, I would love to have the honor of helping that new species kind of
Yes.
come into its own. That is exciting to me, and that is how I see myself actually.
And when you talk about growing up, I mean, I'm continuously through this conversation thinking about the listener who has been with me for the whole time and is like, "Wait, where are we going now and why are we going this way?" And I think to be able to really hold how challenging it is to move a system and to help a system heal, that takes a lot of energy, that takes a lot of trust in oneself, it takes a lot of connection with your personal power. And that tells me you've done a shit ton of your own work. And when I think to why am I here now? Because I've become more interested in systems. And I remember I've been a therapist for 15 years. So I went to grad school like 16, 17 years ago. And I remember in school thinking, I do not want anything to do with this macro shit. That is way too much for me. It's just too chaotic. It's too much. I can't handle it. It makes me anxious. I'm just going to stick with the one-on-one. And for listeners who've been with me for the past, I think we've been doing this 6 or 7 years now, I've built capacity to take care of myself and to trust myself more, that I can tolerate and that I have something to offer the systems, and I do think that healing is paramount in this, because if we're not healing ourselves, there's not going to be anybody to work in these healthy systems, right? So it's all
Mhm.
interconnected and intertwined.
I'm curious how you would describe when you say, I don't actually remember how you said it, but something about increasing capacity to see like the big, like to go kind of the levels up and walking upstream and
Yeah.
seeing like, wait, what is the next bigger system that this plugs
Yeah.
into? What does it feel like inside of you kind of to have that increased capacity? Can
Oof.
you say more about that?
Ooh, what a good question. So, are you familiar with the audience knows exactly what I'm going to say here? Are you familiar with NARM? Have you heard of neuroaffective relational model?
No.
Okay. It's a therapy modality created by Lawrence Heller. And I always say that it's like Buddhism, somatic therapy, and psychoanalytic therapy had a baby, because it sort of combines all of this. And the whole thing about NARM is, when growing up, we all have misattunements, we all have developmental traumas between us and our parents and our environment around us. Everybody just does. This is just, you can't have a perfect environment, right? And what we as children do with that is, instead of saying, oh, my parents are getting divorced and so they're yelling at each other because it's about them, we always internalize it and think there's something wrong with us, right? And so that blaming of the self just perpetuates, and then we continue doing it into adulthood. And so the healing work that I've done on my developmental trauma, and I'm not finished by any means, people, I'm not saying that, but I've come to I've come to the other side of the shame process that I was like, I would say that I was constantly shaming myself in a way that really undermined my trust. And I could appear on the outside with the same amount of power that I am coming to you right now, but I didn't trust it on the inside. And now I trust that power. I trust my intuition on a super deep level. And so I'm able to put more pieces together, because I don't have to spend so much time going like, do you guys see this? Do you guys see what's happening here? Do you see this? Am I right? Am I seeing this okay? Now I'm like, oh, I see this. And so if I keep getting to like, what's causing this, it just keeps getting deeper, but also wider on the systemic level. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So you asked what it feels like. So what does it feel like?
Mhm.
I'm feeling it right now. Rootedness. It feels rooted.
Mhm. Yeah, this is also a topic that's very much up for me. That's why I'm asking.
Mm.
Because I feel that same rootedness. And I think I could subscribe to the same thing you said, even though I might have
Mhm.
sounded similar 5, 6, 7 years ago. I
Mhm.
feel like I'm now like deeply, like
Mhm.
I don't know. There's not really, rootedness is great as a word. I can't even rephrase it in different words because it fits
Mhm.
so well. The other piece is also that it's not as much. Yeah, I guess when when all the pieces kind of start to form more patterns, and one can just hold more because one has kind of,
Right.
it's not the first time one sees it, right?
Right.
It just feels like there's kind of more room inside of me to hold all
Yes.
the, like, yeah, just holding more of them at
Yes.
once, and at the same time being rooted. So it's
Mm-hmm.
a really wonderful place to be. I find it, you know,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes my kids, when they talk about how old I am, like, yeah, I would not, like, I'm happy, but like I would not go back even a single day. I'm
Uh-uh.
so happy with what
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
understand now and where I am now.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's been a real treat the last few years to get to that place.
Yeah. How can I ask how old you are?
I'm turning 45 next
Oh
week.
my God, I'm 45, turning 46 in February.
And there you go. So next week we're gonna be the same age for a while.
Yeah. There's something about this age. It's funny because
Yeah.
the way I've been describing it to people is that emotionally, I am the healthiest I've ever been. Physically, on the other hand, perimenopause is kicking my ass. But I understand now why, like, I remember reading magazines when I was younger and women in their 40s saying, like, yeah, I feel better than I've ever felt before. It's because I trust myself. And I'm guessing there's
Yeah.
something about this decade that creates more space. There's more wisdom to look behind, right? There's more times when you probably survived something hard, right? That you can call on to say like, "No, I'm kind of badass."
Yes.
Well, I there's so many more things we could talk about, and I'm curious if you have thoughts about the evolution of our like democracy from a political standpoint when you think about sociocracy and applying that.
Yeah. Well, let me start from this end. So sometimes people are like, "Oh, could we, just take sociocracy as is and apply it to countries, and or like to towns or whatever?" And I'm afraid there's one reason why we can't, and
Mhm.
that is, so sociocracy, the word, as used by the person who put this together in the late 1970s. So the word originally means those who associate together govern,
Mm.
right? Socios, those who associate together,
Mhm.
and then cracy, like in democracy, for governance.
Mm.
Now, in a town, let's say my town has like a population of 80,000. How many of them are needed to run the town?
Right.
I honestly don't know, but I'm guessing it's not more than 3,000 people. Let's just say that.
Yeah.
So everybody else is working other things. So if we use sociocracy to run the town, we would have 3,000 people in circles and 77,000 wouldn't be.
Right.
So that's why democracy as this representation, like where you have representative model, makes some sense. Or one flips it entirely on its head and say super hyper localized governance, right?
Yeah.
And says, okay, now we have to go from neighborhood to like the next bigger district, whatever, and so on, towns, and then bioregions. Like it has to be something that makes sense. You can't
Yep.
just draw lines on a map.
Yep.
That I think has some promise, but that's we have to do so much prefigurative work and work on like, because that's the passing the baton again, just on the super large scale. Are like people are not able to run a meeting,
Right.
like in a way
Exactly.
that I would find, like the way,
Right.
state of the art.
Right.
You want to run a country, and like, I'm not sure. Like,
Right.
so why? So my guess is that there is a direction there. And for example, if you look at indigenous models, they're fairly similar to what sociocracy is like, and
Mhm.
they've run whole population. So that's so yes, sure, we can do that. I just don't want to jump too far and too fast.
Yeah.
I guess that's where. Yeah, I just want to get it really right and kind of get people ready to
Yeah.
take this level of responsibility and try out and all the personal out of that. Yeah, but maybe one thing that I would want people to see as one part of democracy is that, and I'm sure you're aware of that, but let's use majority vote, just that piece. The problem with majority vote, where you vote yes or no, or this or that, or whatever, ABC, is that these are inherently competitive
Right.
spaces, right? And another piece is that, so now we've set the candidates up for competing to each other, which is exactly what they do, because that is what the system rewards. That's what the system requires them to do. Even if they went home and said, well, that felt crappy, they still have to do it, because if you don't do it, you lose, and that's that.
Right.
So there's compassion in me for just the actors being the way they are, because what else are they going to do? That's our system.
Yeah.
And there's this great quote from Jared Enberg, who put together Sociocracy, of The predominant, no, behavior is determined by the predominant patterns of decision making or something. It's like, yeah, we live in a democratic world, and that's how we all show up. We also live in a capitalist world, and that's how it's all the same competitive system.
Yeah.
Now, so I guess, that's where I want to just talk about the game and not so much the players, because the players are also just part of the system. So there we
Exactly.
are. I would exactly, I mean, maybe, I don't know, probably I would act exactly the same given the same system. And then what's neat about consent by comparison is that consent prioritizes the group in an interesting way. So let's say, super back to sociocracy for a moment, if you have, let's say, a website circle, they would define the aim of the website circle. That is probably something like maintaining and managing the website so that content is accessible or something like that. And now every proposal that comes in that somebody makes needs to be run by like an alignment check with our aim. Does this harm the aim? Then we shouldn't do it, or we should tweak it enough that it doesn't harm. And if it doesn't seem to harm, sure, try it out. Now, that means that every proposal is run by that group aim. So basically, the group becomes its own identity, which is expressed in the aim. And now everything can be run by what is best for the group that we've defined. Now, voting, basically, that's hit or miss, right? So if you and I vote on my proposal, then you might say yes, or you might say no. But I never find out what the reason was, and whether it was simply that you didn't like it or that you thought it was bad for the group.
Right.
So as a decision-making method, it's just not giving us the information. So it's biasing us towards a competitive behavior. And it's not giving us the information it needs us to give. So it's really not fit for purpose. That's why anybody who is in an organization that votes, to me, that's just a non-starter for me, that we really shouldn't do that. Yeah, so then ideally, there needs to be more conversation about what's good for the whole. And that's, of course, as far away as from where we are, especially in this country, as it can be right now.
Yeah. Well, there's so much more to unpack about that, but I'm sure you've got other stuff to get to, and so do I. So if people are interested in finding out more about Sociocracy, checking it out for their organization, where do they go?
They go to sociocracyforall.org. And there's a training page there and resources and so on. There's also books that people can find. Just type in Sociocracy wherever you go for books. There's also videos and stuff. Actually, the next thing that I'm doing after this call is record a little bit of an introduction that we will make available. So there will constantly be new content. So just see whatever the status is right now as you check. There's plenty to go on, because closing that gap between hearing about it and then learning about it and being able to do it, that's what we do.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for being here. I really hope we stay connected. And I have big plans for the therapy field. And so I'm sure I'd love to introduce you to more people so that we can see what we can shake up in this way.
Lovely. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks to our guests for an amazing conversation today. To find out more about our guests, you can visit www.headheartbiztherapy.com/podcast. You can find me at Head Heart Biz Therapy on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks as always to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for editing, to Liam O'Donnell for the album art, and to Ben Mueller for our theme music. And I'm your host, Sarah Bueno. Until next time.